Hello, and welcome to Lecture 6. As I mentioned in Lecture 5, The True Self, this lecture number 6, will focus on the shadow selves, and is indeed titled The Shadow Selves. My name is Joe, and I am Andrew's spirit guide. So let's dive straight in. What is the shadow? Well, many of you may be familiar with the term, the ego. Now, what I teach is simple. I share the umbrella term of the shadow to embrace all that is not of consciousness, which also encompasses the ego. This simplified umbrella term is something I've used with Andrew very directly on his journey through the shadow. Now, what I mean by this is simply that Andrew became very familiar with the shadow very early on in his journey. The term the shadow, in the way I use it, as I mentioned, to embrace everything that is not of consciousness. Now he has journeyed with this term and has found it very, very invaluable in regards to simplifying his excavation of his own shadow, because he has a very complex, multidimensional self. And what I mean by this is that the way the shadow expresses itself in his multidimensional self and the way consciousness expresses itself can get very, very dynamic. So, let's look into examples of what the shadow is in order to somewhat unpack its expression. A simple one will be pain, physical pain, let's say. If you are feeling pain anywhere in your body, this is an aspect of the shadow, not of consciousness. Let's look at an emotion, guilt. If you are feeling guilt of any resonance, this is an aspect of the shadow self. Another example, frustration. If you are feeling frustrated to any degree, this is another aspect of the shadow. Another example, sadness. If you are feeling sad, this is another aspect of the shadow. And the list goes on. The spectrum of the shadow is vast. It is complex. Consciousness, however, the true self, is less complex. And it knows itself. Yes, the true self, consciousness, knows itself. In truth, it actually knows how the shadow works. So it knows the shadow to a degree in regards to how it expresses itself and its workings. But consciousness is separate from the shadow. It does not feel the shadow. How is this so, some of you may ask? It just is. That is the answer. It just is. Because if you sit here trying to logicalize it somewhat, which you're welcome to do, you may get somewhat lost. And I say this simply because there are many teachings out there, many sharings, many schools of thought in regards to this topic. But this is what I share as truth. And the other teachings, they may share whatever they share as truth. But what I trust is that you will pick up what you need to pick up on your journey through life. Because that's what's important. You too have your own soul, your conscious self, your true self, your spirit guides working with you. And so, just to clarify, this is my teaching. This is how I work with Andrew. I frame the shadow as separate from consciousness because it is. But many other teachings will tell you different. You may hear teachings along the lines of, God is everything, including the darkness. Now, you're welcome to embrace that. That is your choice. But that is not what I teach here. And that is not what Andrew knows to be true. But yes, in simple terms, because this is only a short lecture, the shadow is, let's say, the darker part of the being, of your multidimensional self. And the true self is the conscious, loving aspect of the being. So if you were to write down a list on either side, one titled the shadow, one titled the true self, the list would be very, very contrasting. That said, seeing as many of you are seekers and still discovering and trying to understand what the shadow is, whether you call it that or not, and also trying to understand what love is, you may come across some conflated ideas in this regards. Simply because you very often, in fact, in truth, always experience the shadow at the same time as consciousness. I often refer to them as shadow cocktails or conscious cocktails, simply because of the mixture of the two. At which point it's very difficult at times to discern what is the shadow and what is consciousness. This is something Andrew has done profoundly on his journey. He's excavated very, very deeply in order to understand the workings of the shadow. That's just his choice, a choice he made before he incarnated. It was a soul's choice to understand the shadow in that somewhat cathartic framework and experience. And what I mean by this is this multidimensional self that I channel through, which is labeled Andrew, has a very, very, or at least had a very, very intense and expanded shadow self. The spectrum was vast, and so the soul aspect of Andrew decided to come in very expanded also, in order to guide the multidimensional self through his journey in life, with his eyes very much open. Does that make him special because he has an expanded consciousness? Or does it make him bad because he has an expanded spectrum of shadow? No, it just is. You all have shadow and consciousness to different degrees. And you manifest in physical form in order to release and clear, heal, if you like, the shadow. alchemize, if you like, to some degree. I use that term very carefully, the shadow. But regardless, the shadow is not of consciousness and represents everything that is not of consciousness. That is the conclusion of lecture number 6. Thank you for listening. And yes, there will be further talks that relate to the shadow self, or rather the shadow selves, because it is vast and it is not united, which is why the lecture is titled The Shadow Selves as opposed to self. Multiple. Again, thank you for listening.